The first thing Simone Reed noticed was the laughter. It wasn't warm. It wasn't accidental. It cut through the grand hall of the Adler Lakeside Museum like a blade, sharp, deliberate, and loud enough to demand witnesses. Crystal chandeliers glittered above hundreds of Chicago's most powerful figures, their tuxedos and gowns moving like a carefully choreographed dance of money and influence. This was the Winter Patrons Ball, the kind of night where reputations were polished, alliances sealed, and futures quietly negotiated over champagne flutes. Simone stood perfectly still near the marble staircase, her fingers tightening around her glass as she followed the sound. There he was, Hayes Calloway, her husband of 11 years. He was leaning in, too close, toward a tall, blonde woman in an ivory gown. Blair Sutherland, his communications director. The woman who had been appearing at more and more events lately, the woman whose hand now rested comfortably against his arm, her posture relaxed in a way that only comes from practiced intimacy. Then Blair laughed again, tilting her head back just enough for her voice to carry. "Oh, you should see his wife," she said, her tone light, amused. "She tries so hard to belong in rooms like this. It's almost admirable." A few people chuckled, not loudly, politely, safely. "And let's be honest," Blair continued, lowering her voice just enough to make it cruel rather than crude. "Hayes keeps her around because it looks good. But we all know she's not really built for this world." Simone felt the glass slip from her hand. It shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing through the hall like a gunshot. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. For a fraction of a second, the room noticed her. And then they didn't. Hayes looked up. His eyes met Simone's across the room. For a brief, almost imperceptible moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition, calculation, relief. He did not walk toward her. He did not correct Blair. He did not defend his wife. He simply turned back and smiled. That was when Simone understood. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake. This was a performance. And she was meant to play the role of the woman who didn't belong. If you've ever felt that moment, when the room decides who you are before you get to speak, you'll want to stay with this story. And if stories about power, betrayal, and quiet revenge resonate with you, you already know what to do. Tap the like button, leave a comment if this feels familiar, and follow along. This is only the beginning. Simone forced herself to breathe. Slowly, deliberately. She had spent years mastering this skill, remaining composed while navigating rooms built on unspoken hierarchies. As a Black woman in spaces that prized polish over truth, she had learned early that emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford in public. She lifted her chin and stepped away from the shattered glass. Around her, Chicago's elite resumed their conversations with impressive efficiency. A donor from the North Shore whispered to his wife. A city councilman checked his phone. Someone laughed a little too loudly, grateful the discomfort wasn't theirs. The museum glowed with curated perfection. Marble columns, oil paintings on loan from private collections, a string quartet playing something soft and European. Every detail screamed legitimacy, belonging. Simone had helped build this world. She had introduced Hayes to half the people in this room: investors, cultural board members, nonprofit leaders, political donors. She had smoothed conversations, translated tensions, framed narratives in ways that made him appear visionary, inclusive, inevitable. For years, she had been the bridge between power and trust. And now she stood alone, watching her husband offer his arm to another woman as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Blair leaned in again, whispering something to Hayes. He laughed, an easy, confident laugh Simone recognized instantly. It was the laugh he used when he was winning. A photographer drifted closer. Simone noticed the angle. Hayes shifted slightly, guiding Blair into the light. The camera clicked. A perfect picture. Simone felt something cold settle in her chest. Not heartbreak, not yet, but clarity. the kind that arrives when denial finally collapses under the weight of evidence. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about desire. It was about replacement. She turned toward the exit, the sound of the quartet fading behind her. As she walked down the museum steps into the icy Chicago night, she could still hear Blair's voice in her head, light and amused, confident in her borrowed power. They thought she was invisible. They thought she would endure. They thought this was the end of her story. Simone paused at the bottom of the stairs, the city skyline stretching out before her, sharp and bright against the dark lake. This wasn't the end. This was the moment the trial began. Hayes Calloway found her near the West Terrace, where the wind off Lake Michigan cut cleanly through silk and illusion. For a moment, Simone almost admired his timing. He waited just long enough for witnesses to notice him approaching, long enough for the donors clustered nearby to register that the devoted husband was stepping in. Then he smiled. Not the smile he used in private, not the one that softened when he was tired or uncertain. This was the public smile, the one that had helped him raise millions, close impossible deals, and convince entire rooms that he was trustworthy. "Simone," he said gently, as if greeting her for the first time that evening. "There you are." There you are. Not, "Are you all right?" Not, "I heard what she said." Not, "I'm sorry." He placed a careful hand at the small of her back, guiding her slightly away from the doors. The gesture looked intimate from a distance, protective. Anyone watching would have assumed he was rescuing his wife from an awkward moment. Simone felt the pressure of his fingers and understood the truth instantly. This wasn't comfort, it was choreography. "You dropped your glass," he murmured, his voice low, calm, managerial. "People noticed. We don't want this to turn into a scene." A scene. She turned her head slowly and looked at him. Up close, his eyes were bright, alert, scanning, not her face, but the room behind her. Counting eyes, gauging damage, calculating angles. "She insulted me," Simone said quietly. Hayes' smile did not falter. "Blair can be unfiltered." She didn't mean anything by unfiltered. That was the word he chose. Simone waited. She gave him space, the same way she always had, allowing him the opportunity to do the right thing, to correct the narrative, to draw a line. And he leaned in closer, his voice dropping another register. "Tonight isn't about us. There are cameras everywhere, donors, board members. We can talk later." Later was where apologies went to die. Across the terrace, Blair stood laughing with two men from a development firm Hayes had been courting for months. One of them glanced over, his gaze lingering on Simone for a fraction of a second before sliding away. Discomfort quickly buried. No one wanted to choose sides too early. Hayes followed her line of sight and adjusted his stance, subtly blocking Simone from view. From the outside, it looked like concern. From the inside, it felt like erasure. "Why is she here?" Simone asked. Hayes exhaled softly, as though she were being unreasonable. "She's part of the team now. People expect to see her." Part of the team. The words landed with more force than Blair's mockery had. Because this time, there was no cruelty in his tone, only certainty, as if the decision had already been made, discussed, agreed upon in rooms Simone had not been invited into. A photographer stepped closer again. Hayes turned slightly, angling himself so Simone was half hidden behind his shoulder. He smiled wider, lifted his glass and nodded at the lens. Click. That was the moment Simone understood what his smile was doing. It wasn't reassuring anyone. It was selling her out. The image would circulate by morning. Hayes Calloway, composed and gracious, managing a minor disruption with elegance. His wife, blurred, obscured, unnamed. The narrative would be clean, controlled, favorable. Blair's laughter floated across the terrace again, brighter now, emboldened. She had seen Hayes intervene. She had seen him choose optics over loyalty. She had been given permission. Simone felt a familiar instinct rise in her chest, the urge to smooth things over, to protect the larger picture, to absorb the insult so the machine could keep running. She had done it before, countless times, corrected tone, reframed conversations, smiled when she wanted to scream. For a split second, she considered. Then she caught her reflection in the glass doors behind them. A woman, perfectly styled, perfectly silent, perfectly replaceable. No, Simone said. The word was soft, but it landed like a rupture. Hayes blinked. No? No, she repeated, stepping out from behind his shoulder. You don't get to manage me. A ripple of attention shifted nearby. Not enough to cause a scene, just enough. Hayes's smile tightened. Simone, he warned under his breath, don't do this here. She looked at him fully now, really looked, at the confidence, the entitlement, the ease with which he had decided her role without her consent. You already did this, she said. I'm just the last one to know. For the first time that night, something cracked behind his eyes. Not guilt, irritation. The irritation of a man realizing a variable he thought was controlled might not be. Go home, he said quietly. We'll talk in the morning. Simone nodded once. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. She turned and walked away from him, past the chandeliers, past the donors, past the curated beauty of a world she had helped sustain and was now being pushed out of. Behind her, Hayes remained on the terrace, his smile returning smoothly as Blair slipped back to his side. By the time Simone stepped into the waiting car, the narrative had already begun to shift without her. What Hayes didn't realize, what that smile had cost him, was that for the first time in 11 years, Simone Reed had stopped trying to protect the story they were telling together. And once a woman stops doing that, everything changes. The penthouse was flawless in the way a museum exhibit is flawless. Beautiful, expensive, and never meant to feel lived in. When Simone stepped inside, the foyer lights bloomed automatically, soft gold washing over imported stone, and art that had been chosen to signal taste rather than joy. The city glittered beyond the wall of glass. Chicago's skyline cut sharp against the black lake, a crown of steel and ambition. She had once loved this view. It had made her feel like the world was opening. Tonight it looked like a cage. Her heels clicked across the marble. 1, 2, 3, each sound echoing too long in the quiet, as if the apartment wanted her to hear how alone she was. Hayes wasn't home. Of course he wasn't. He would be out finishing the performance, letting cameras catch him laughing beside Blair, letting rumors ripen into certainty. Simone slid off her coat and hung it carefully, out of habit. She hated that her hands still moved with the instinct to maintain order, to keep everything pristine, to preserve the illusion that nothing was wrong. There were fresh flowers on the console table, orchids, white and coldly elegant. The kind Hayes liked because they photographed well. She stared at them and felt something in her chest tighten. 11 years. 11 years of dinners where she memorized names and preferences, where she learned which donors needed flattery and which needed deference, where she turned Hayes's raw confidence into something palatable, something respectable. 11 years of shaping rooms and conversations so that he would be received as inevitable. And now the same rooms were being used to erase her. She walked through the living area slowly, as if seeing it for the first time. The furniture was arranged for entertaining, not comfort. The seating angles encouraged intimacy, carefully designed so people would lean in, exchange secrets, form alliances. Simone had done that, not a decorator, a strategist. The apartment had been her stage, her instrument. On the wall hung a framed photo from their wedding, Hayes's arm around her waist, his smile bright, charming, immaculate. Simone had remembered that day as love. Tonight she saw it differently, like an acquisition sealed. His expression wasn't joy, it was triumph. Her phone buzzed. A text from a woman who had once called her sister. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to do. Are you okay? Another message, colder. People are talking, just be careful. And then the silence, names that didn't appear, people who had watched her be insulted and decided neutrality was safer than decency. Simone set the phone down face up on the kitchen counter, as if daring it to say something honest. She poured herself water, not wine. She needed clarity more than comfort. The faucet ran with a soft hiss, and in that thin, ordinary sound she felt the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. Her reflection in the dark window looked like a stranger. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect composure. A woman trained to remain elegant while being wounded. She swallowed and tasted metal. Like bitterness and restraint had the same flavor. Her hands drifted toward her purse. A familiar impulse rose. Call her mother. Call her best friend from college. Collapse into someone safe and let the dam break. She even unlocked her phone. Her mother's name sat there like a lifeline. Simone hovered for 3 seconds, long enough to feel the old identity tug at her. The one who wanted to be held, who wanted to hear, "Baby, come home. You don't have to fight this alone." Then another voice cut through her chest, quieter but harder. "If you call now, you will cry. If you cry, you will be soothed. If you are soothed, you will return to being manageable." The thought startled her with its precision. She set the phone down again. Not because she didn't love her mother, not because she didn't need someone, but because Simone recognized a trap she had fallen into for years. The trap of processing pain in private so she could perform strength in public. The trap of surviving instead of changing the conditions that hurt her. She walked deeper into the apartment. Every object carried a story. A sculpture from an artist she had championed, now credited to Hayes' eye for culture. A signed book from a senator who'd once taken Simone's policy suggestions seriously, until Hayes began attending meetings alone. A grand piano in the corner, polished and silent, purchased with her inheritance, played less and less as her life became a constant negotiation of his needs. In the hallway, the door to Hayes' office stood slightly ajar. Simone stopped. Her pulse moved into her throat. The office was the one room Hayes treated like sacred ground, a place of deals and strategy, a place where he could be brilliant without needing her. He had always said it with a smile, "You have your world, Simone. This is mine." She had believed him. She stepped closer. The air seemed cooler here, as if the apartment itself held its breath. She pushed the door open fully. Inside, the desk lamp cast a pool of light over papers arranged with deliberate neatness. A laptop sat open, screen awake. For a moment, Simone hesitated again, not out of fear, but out of a lifetime of boundaries she'd been trained not to cross. This was a line good wives didn't step over. This was the territory where trust lived. Then she remembered Blair's laugh, and Hayes' smile, and the camera's click. Trust, she realized, had already been crossed, just not by her. Simone moved forward and sat in the leather chair that still carried the faint scent of Hayes' cologne. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. She expected passwords, encryption, obstacles. Instead, the laptop unlocked with a single tap. Hayes had never imagined she would look. Simone stared at the screen, at the open folders, at the emails and calendars and documents waiting like a confession. The penthouse around her remained quiet, beautiful, immaculate. But the silence was changing. It was no longer the silence of comfort. It was the silence before the truth begins to speak. The screen glowed softly, indifferent to the life it was about to dismantle. Simone stared at the open laptop, her reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. Eyes steady, jaw set, breath controlled. For years, she had respected this boundary without question. Hayes' office, Hayes' work, Hayes' world. She had been invited to support it, decorate it, explain it to others, but never to enter it unfiltered. The irony settled in slowly. She hadn't needed to guess a password. She hadn't needed to break anything. Hayes had always been careless with the things he believed were his, alone. The desktop was a meticulous grid of folders, each labeled with the same precision he used when speaking to donors. Campaign strategy, private investments, communications, BS, legal. Simone's fingers hovered, then moved with quiet certainty. She opened the last one. At first it looked harmless. Calendars, travel schedules, expense reports, The ordinary machinery of ambition. Then she saw the transfers. Monthly payments, routed through layered accounts, sent to Blair Sutherland. Not modest sums, not reimbursements, amounts large enough to fund a life. Enough to make loyalty feel permanent. Enough to disguise dependency as partnership. Simone scrolled slowly, methodically, the way she used to read policy drafts, looking not just for what was written, but for what was implied. The dates overlap with moments she remembered clearly. Fundraisers she had hosted, trips she had declined so Hayes could focus. Nights he came home distracted, distant, already elsewhere. Her pulse remained steady. That surprised her. She opened another file. Property acquisitions. 2 condos, one in her name, without her signature, one in Blair's, listed under an LLC she didn't recognize. Simone leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under her weight, as a different kind of realization took hold. This wasn't recklessness, this was preparation. She clicked into campaign strategy. The documents here were cleaner, sharper. Polling data, voter segmentation, messaging frameworks. Simone recognized pieces of her own thinking embedded in the language, phrases she'd used casually over dinner, insights she'd offered in passing, now polished and weaponized. Then she saw the memo. It was short, clinical, brutal in its efficiency. Simone Reed presents a challenge in several key districts. Her background in optics complicate relatability with moderate voters. Recommend repositioning personal narrative prior to announcement. Simone read it once. Then again, the words were bloodless, almost polite. They spoke of her as a variable, a liability, a problem to be managed. There was no mention of marriage, no acknowledgement of partnership, just strategy. Her throat tightened, but she kept reading. Another document followed. This one marked communications plan, transition. Blair's name appeared repeatedly. Fresh energy, modern appeal, approachable. There was even a suggested timeline, public appearances, soft launches, controlled leaks to friendly media. And then the line that hollowed her chest. BS offers a cleaner narrative. All-American, aspirational, uncomplicated. Simone closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of it pressing in. 11 years of building, of smoothing, of translating herself so others would feel comfortable, reduced to an inconvenience. She scrolled further. Emails between Hayes and his campaign consultant. Casual, familiar. Men congratulating each other on their foresight. She'll understand eventually. She's resilient. We'll make sure she's taken care of. Taken care of. As if she were a project, not a person. Simone's hand moved to the trackpad again. Slower now. She opened the communications folder labeled with Blair's initials. Draft speeches, talking points, media briefs. And there it was. An interview outline for a feature in a national magazine. How Hayes Calloway learned the importance of evolution in business, leadership, and life. The phrasing was careful, almost elegant. It framed change as growth, distance as maturity. It painted the end of a marriage not as betrayal, but as wisdom. Simone could already hear Hayes delivering the lines with practiced humility. She imagined herself on the other side of that story, unnamed, undefined, quietly erased. For the first time since leaving the gala, something cracked. Not a sob, not a scream, a soundless fracture. Simone stood and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. The city pulsed below her, alive and indifferent. Somewhere in that sprawl were people who knew her work, who trusted her judgment, who had once looked to her for guidance. And yet here, in this immaculate room, she had been reduced to an obstacle. She understood now why Hayes had smiled. He hadn't been choosing Blair over her. He had been choosing simplicity over truth, optics over loyalty, power over partnership. Simone turned back to the desk. She sat down again, straighter this time. Purpose settled in where shock had been. She began opening files systematically, saving copies, forwarding documents to an encrypted folder she created on the spot. Dates, amounts, language, patterns. She wasn't panicking. She was documenting. This wasn't about catching him. It was about understanding him. As the clock on the screen ticked forward, Simone Reed crossed an invisible line, the one between being the woman things happen to and the woman who collects evidence. Hayes had built his future on the assumption that she would never look. He was wrong. And by the time he realized it, the password he'd never thought she'd try would no longer matter at all. By morning, the story no longer belonged to Simone. She woke to the quiet hum of the city and the familiar weight of her phone vibrating against the nightstand. Notifications stacked one on top of another, lighting the screen in pale blue flashes that felt accusatory rather than urgent. For a moment, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, letting the residue of the night before settle into something she could name. Then she reached for the phone. The first message was sympathy, carefully worded and useless. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. People can be cruel." The second was worse. "I hope you're okay. Last night was complicated." Complicated. As if cruelty needed context. She scrolled. A former board member sent a heart emoji and nothing else. A donor's wife wrote, "Call me when things calm down." Another message arrived from someone she hadn't spoken to in months. "Just checking in. Are the rumors true?" Rumors. Simone exhaled slowly, the way she did before walking into rooms where she knew she would have to translate herself. Except this time, the room was the entire city. She opened social media. There it was. The image Hayes had curated so carefully. He and Blair on the museum terrace, laughing, bodies angled toward one another like they'd been practicing for weeks. The caption read something bland and flattering. "Power, progress, and partnership at the Winter Patrons Ball." Partnership. Simone searched for herself in the photo and found only a blur of dark fabric at the edge of the frame, cropped out with surgical precision. She wasn't just excluded, she was erased. Comments spilled beneath the post. "Love this energy. Chicago's future looks bright. They make such a great team." Simone set the phone down again, her hands steady despite the pressure building in her chest. This was how it happened. Not all at once, not with a single lie, but with 1,000 small edits until the truth became unrecognizable. The next message came through as she poured coffee. "You should lie low for a bit," someone advised. "Let things blow over. Lie low." That was always the prescription. Be quiet. Be graceful. Don't disrupt the narrative. Simone leaned against the counter and closed her eyes. She could already see the shape of the story forming without her consent. She was unstable. She was emotional. She was struggling to adjust. None of it would be said outright. It would be implied, delivered with concern, framed as care. Her phone buzzed again. This time, the message made her pause. "Darling, that display last night was beneath him and her. Coffee this afternoon? I think it's time we talk." Isadora Vale. Simone stared at the name, her pulse shifting. Isadora wasn't part of Hayes' inner circle. She didn't orbit him. She had built her empire long before he'd learned how to pronounce the word philanthropy. If Isadora was reaching out, it wasn't for gossip. Still, Simone didn't reply immediately. She opened her email instead. There, waiting patiently in her inbox, were the subtler attacks. A cultural foundation she'd advised for years informed her that her presence on an upcoming committee was being reconsidered given current circumstances. A consulting firm she'd spoken with just days earlier wrote to say they were pausing discussions to respect personal transitions. Personal transitions. Simone laughed then, once, sharply. The sound startled her. She understood now that what she was witnessing wasn't reaction. It was rollout. Hayes hadn't simply betrayed her. He prepared for her removal the way he prepared for everything else, quietly, strategically, in advance. The gala hadn't been the beginning. It had been the announcement. She walked back into the office, the laptop still open where she'd left it. The files she'd saved the night before sat neatly in their folder, waiting. Evidence without emotion. Facts without interpretation. And suddenly, The messages made sense. The distance, the hesitation, the concern masquerading as kindness. They weren't responding to her behavior. They were responding to a story already being fed to them. Simone imagined the conversations happening without her. Blair's voice, warm and rehearsed. Hayes' tone, regretful but resolute. She's been having a hard time. She's not herself lately. We're trying to protect her dignity. Dignity. The word people use when they meant silence. Her phone vibrated again. A text from her mother this time, simple and devastating in its restraint. I saw the picture. Are you safe? Simone swallowed. For a fleeting moment, she wanted to call. To let someone see her before the city finished rewriting her. To rage and cry and demand fairness like it still existed in rooms like this. Instead, she typed back, I'm okay. I'll explain soon. She wasn't ready to explain yet, not to anyone else, and not even fully to herself. Because understanding the narrative they were writing about her required something harder than grief. It required distance. Simone sat down at the desk and opened a fresh document. She didn't title it Response or Defense. She titled it Record. She began to write, not feelings, not interpretations, but dates, conversations, names, contributions, introductions she'd made that had changed trajectories, ideas that had been absorbed, polished, and presented without her name attached. Outside, the city moved on, already consuming the version of her that had been offered up for public digestion. Inside, Simone Reed was doing something far more dangerous than arguing back. She was learning the story well enough to dismantle it. And once a woman understands the narrative being written about her, she can decide whether to fight it or replace it entirely. Isadora Vale chose a corner table at the back of the cafe, the kind of place where conversations disappeared into the low hum of privilege and routine. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the river, but the light inside was deliberately subdued, flattering, forgiving. Simone noticed the details immediately. Isadora never left ambiance to chance. She was already seated when Simone arrived, impeccably dressed in charcoal silk and restraint, her silver hair pulled back with the confidence of a woman who had nothing left to prove. She looked up, met Simone's eyes, and smiled, not with sympathy, but with recognition. Sit, Isadora said simply. No, I'm sorry. No. How are you holding up? Just an invitation. Simone took the seat across from her. For the first time since the gala, she felt the unfamiliar sensation of being seen without being evaluated. Isadora studied her for a moment, her gaze calm and assessing. You didn't cry last night, she said. At least, not in public. Simone didn't bother pretending surprise. No. Good, Isadora replied. That tells me you're dangerous. The waiter came and went. Coffee arrived untouched. Isadora leaned back slightly. Men like Hayes, she began, don't cheat accidentally. They don't erase women impulsively. They do it the same way they do business, by testing, isolating, and then replacing. Simone's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. They start by borrowing your authority, Isadora continued. Then they convince the room it was always theirs. By the time they push you out, the audience believes they're watching a natural evolution. She paused, letting the words land. I've lived this, Isadora said quietly. Different city, different man, same pattern. Simone felt something shift. Not relief, not comfort, but alignment. Like two puzzle pieces clicking together. I thought if I stayed composed, if I didn't make waves, Simone began. Isadora raised a hand. That's what they count on. Grace, loyalty, your desire to be reasonable. Her eyes sharpened. Tell me, have they started questioning your stability yet? Isadora nodded. There it is. She reached into her bag and placed a slim leather notebook on the table, sliding it toward Simone. The pages inside were filled. Tight handwriting, dates, initials, arrows connecting names. This, Isadora said, is what saved me. Simone opened it carefully. Receipts, not dramatic ones, not incriminating in the legal sense, but devastating in the only way that mattered, proof of authorship. of origin, of intellectual labor quietly siphoned away. They will never fight you on emotion, Isadora said. They will win that every time. They fight on credibility, on narrative, on who the room believes. She leaned forward now, voice dropping. And right now, the room believes them. Simone closed the notebook slowly. So what do I do? Isadora's smile was thin, knowing. You stop trying to correct the story. You let them finish telling it. Simone looked up sharply. Because, Isadora continued, once they're done, once they've committed fully to the lie, you present the truth, not as defense, but as revelation. The word hung between them. Revelation. They think you're alone, Isadora said. They think your power was borrowed. They think your silence means consent. Her eyes softened just slightly. It doesn't. She reached across the table and tapped the notebook. You document. You remember. You reconnect with the people who knew you before you became convenient. Simone's chest tightened, not with fear, but with something steadier. Resolve. And Blair? Simone asked, the name tasting strange in her mouth. Isadora's expression shifted, just a fraction. She's not your enemy. She's your evidence. Simone frowned. Women like her are useful because they rush the process, Isadora explained. They step into roles they don't understand, claim credit they can't defend. When the questions come, and they will, she won't survive them. Isadora sat back. But you must be patient. Patience. The word felt different now, not passive, strategic. Isadora finished her coffee and stood, gathering her coat. You don't need revenge, she said. You need positioning. She paused, then added, and one more thing. Simone looked up. Do not warn him, Isadora said. Men like Hayes are most dangerous when they feel cornered. Let him believe you're still processing, still hurt, still small. Her gaze held Simone's, unblinking. Survivors don't announce their comeback. They prepare it. As Isadora walked away, leaving the notebook behind, Simone remained seated, her hands resting on its worn leather cover. Outside, the river moved steadily forward, indifferent to the quiet reckoning taking place inside. For the first time since the gala, Simone didn't feel like she was reacting. She was being initiated. Not into bitterness, not into revenge, but into the lineage of women who learn, too late for fairness, but just in time for power, that survival is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of strategy. Simone began to notice the pattern the way one notices mold in a beautiful house. Not all at once, but in spreading patches that could no longer be ignored. It started with an invitation that never reached her. A cultural foundation she had advised for nearly 4 years announced a new initiative on urban equity and arts access. Simone saw it on Instagram first, posted with careful enthusiasm and professional lighting. She recognized the language immediately, the phrasing, the structure, even the sequence of priorities. It was her work. The caption credited Blair Sutherland for bringing a bold, inclusive vision to the table. Simone stared at the screen, her coffee cooling untouched beside her. She didn't feel shock. Shock was too loud, too emotional. What she felt instead was a tightening, a quiet internal alignment of facts snapping into place. This wasn't coincidence. She opened her calendar and scrolled back 6 months. There it was, a lunch meeting she had hosted, a proposal she had outlined, a follow-up email she had sent, never answered. At the time, she'd been told the board was exploring other directions. Apparently, they had found one, with her fingerprints still on it. The theft was clean, elegant. Blair hadn't copied Simone's words directly. She'd done something more insidious, absorbed the ideas, stripped them of their origin, and repackaged them as instinct, as vision, as fresh thinking. Simone recognized the tactic because she'd helped Hayes use it before. She began paying closer attention. At a donor reception she attended quietly, no press, no Hayes, she overheard a man praising Blair's insight into community partnerships. Simone asked a single, gentle question. Which communities, she said. The man hesitated, smiled, gave a vague answer. Blair, it turned out, spoke beautifully about concepts, about access and inclusion and representation. But when the conversation turned practical, names, histories, trade-offs, she faltered. Her confidence filled the gaps, but the substance wasn't there. It had never needed to be, because Hayes had always been the bridge, and Simone had always been the architect. The realization settled in with a new kind of anger, not the sharp, burning kind, but something colder. Theft wasn't an act Blair committed once. It was a habit she had inherited, a system she had stepped into and learned to operate efficiently. Simone watched it unfold from the edges. She saw Blair arrive at meetings Simone had once led, carrying folders Simone had once prepared, referencing relationships Simone had once cultivated. She saw Hayes nod approvingly as Blair spoke, occasionally interjecting to clarify, a move Simone knew well. He was guiding her, editing her in real time, making her appear more capable than she was, teaching her the lifestyle. And Blair was learning quickly, not the work, but the posture, the confidence of someone who believed proximity to power was the same thing as competence. The cruelty of it revealed itself fully one afternoon when Simone received a call from an old colleague at a global nonprofit. "They mentioned you by name," the woman said carefully, "but not in a good way." Simone closed her eyes. Apparently, Hayes had called ahead, framing it as concern. He'd suggested Simone was dealing with personal instability, that it might be best to route future collaborations through his team until things settled. Things, always things. That night, Simone sat alone in the apartment and reviewed her records. The notebook from Isadora lay open beside her laptop, its pages now filled with her own additions. Dates, instances, patterns. What struck her wasn't just how often her work had been taken, it was how casually, no guilt, no hesitation, just assumption. Hayes hadn't stolen from her because he hated her. He had stolen because he no longer saw her as separate from himself. Her ideas were his resources. Her reputation was his insulation. Her silence was his permission. And Blair was simply the newest beneficiary. Simone thought back to the gala, to Blair's laugh, to the ease with which she dismissed her as someone who didn't belong. It hadn't been arrogance. It had been rehearsal. Blair had been practicing a role she believed was already hers. But lifestyles built on theft require constant supply. They demand new ideas, new credibility, new labor to consume. And the moment the source stops feeding the machine begins to shake. Simone closed her laptop and stood, walking to the window once more. The city below was restless, alive with ambition and appetite. Somewhere in those buildings, Blair was preparing for her next meeting. Hayes was polishing his next pitch, and the story of Simone Reed was being edited again. They believed they were ahead of her. What they didn't understand, what they had never understood, was that Simone wasn't watching out of nostalgia or grief. She was studying the system. And systems built on theft always collapse the same way. Not with noise, but with exposure. Blair Sutherland had always believed confidence could substitute for depth. It had worked so far. She moved through rooms like someone who belonged there. Chin lifted, shoulders relaxed, smile calibrated just warm enough to disarm without inviting scrutiny. People responded to her certainty. They mistook fluency for fluency of thought, polish for preparation. And as long as Hayes stood close, correcting, affirming, redirecting, no one looked too closely until they did. The first crack appeared during a private roundtable at the Lakeshore Civic Alliance. Blair arrived early, impeccably dressed, carrying a leather folder that matched Hayes's taste more than her own. Simone would have noticed that detail immediately. Blair didn't. The conversation began smoothly enough. Blair spoke about equity, about engagement, about the importance of meeting communities where they are. Heads nodded. Pens moved. Then a woman across the table, an older donor with sharp eyes and a reputation for precision, leaned forward. "Which neighborhood pilot did you reference in your proposal?" she asked lightly. "The one near Bronzeville or the South Shore expansion? Blair's smile held, just barely. Well, she said, laughing softly, both really. It's more about the philosophy than the geography. The donor waited. Silence thickened. Hayes cleared his throat. What Blair means, he interjected smoothly, is that we're still refining scope. The moment passed, but it didn't disappear. After that, the questions changed. Not louder, sharper. At a museum luncheon, a curator asked Blair about the origins of a diversity framework she'd presented weeks earlier. Blair repeated the language perfectly, but when asked why certain trade-offs had been made, she faltered. I think, she said, pausing too long, that intuition plays a role. Intuition. Simone would have smiled at that word. It had been used to diminish her for years. Her research reduced to instinct. Her strategy reframed as feeling. Blair was now wearing the same costume, but it fit poorly. And then came the meeting Hayes wasn't in the room for. It was a donor briefing at a private residence, small and selective. Blair arrived alone, confident in her proximity to power. She spoke for 20 minutes uninterrupted, her voice steady, her posture immaculate. When she finished, a man near the fireplace spoke up. You mentioned coordinating that international partnership, he said. Who handled regulatory alignment? Blair blinked. Our team, she replied. Which team? He pressed. Our global strategy group. A pause. I wasn't aware Hayes had one, another voice said, amused but curious. Blair felt heat rise in her chest. She laughed it off, pivoted, redirected. But the room had shifted. People weren't impressed anymore. They were assessing. Afterward, she retreated to the powder room and stared at her reflection. Perfect makeup, perfect hair, a woman who looked like she belonged. So why did she feel like she was standing on a floor that might give way? That night, she confronted Hayes. You didn't prepare me, she said, trying to keep the edge out of her voice. They're asking questions you never mentioned. Hayes barely looked up from his phone. You're doing fine. I'm not, Blair snapped, then softened quickly. I just need more context. He sighed, irritated now. You're overthinking. They like you. The words landed wrong. Like wasn't respect. Approval wasn't authority. Blair watched him carefully then, noticed how quickly his attention moved away from her distress, how little urgency there was in his reassurance. She realized something unsettling. Hayes didn't need her to be competent. He needed her to be convincing. The next few weeks made that painfully clear. She was placed in more rooms, introduced to more people, praised more publicly. But privately, decisions happened without her. Documents appeared finalized before she saw them. Conversations ended just before she entered. And when she asked questions, Hayes began to smile the way he used to smile at Simone. Patient, corrective, dismissive. You're still learning, he said once, casually. Don't worry about the heavy lifting. The heavy lifting. Blair went home that night and searched Simone Reed's name for the first time with intent. Not gossip, not curiosity, research. What she found unsettled her. Articles, panels, quiet acknowledgments buried in footnotes and credits. A pattern of influence that predated Hayes. Work that didn't announce itself loudly, but endured. Blair closed the laptop slowly. For the first time since stepping into Simone's place, she felt fear. Not of exposure, but of realization. She hadn't replaced Simone. And roles built on substance don't tolerate imposters for long. Blair stood in the dark apartment, Hayes asleep in the bedroom, and felt the mask begin to slip. Not in public, not yet, but in the only place it truly mattered. Inside her own certainty. And once that cracks, no amount of confidence can hold it together. The apartment was quiet in the way only expensive places ever were. Soundproofed, insulated, designed so nothing from the outside world could intrude unless invited. Simone stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the cold stone floor, grinding coffee beans the way she always had. It was a small ritual she'd kept even as everything else shifted. Measure, grind, breathe, control what you can. From down the hall, Hayes's voice drifted out of his office. At first, she didn't register the words, just the tone, that smooth, confident cadence he used when he was performing competence for an audience. The voice that had convinced rooms full of powerful people that he knew exactly what he was doing, even when he was repeating someone else's insight. Simone poured hot water into the press. Then she heard her name. "She's processing it," Hayes said easily, "which is good. We want her calm." Simone froze. The coffee bloomed, steam rising slowly, forgotten. On the other end of the call, a man laughed. Simone recognized the voice. Campaign consultant, seasoned, amused by his own cynicism. "And she won't push back?" Hayes chuckled softly. "She never has. That's the beauty of it." The words landed with surgical precision. "She's always seen herself as the supportive one," Hayes continued. "The bridge builder. She doesn't realize how much she actually contributed. If she did, this would be a lot more complicated." Simone's fingers tightened around the counter. Another voice joined in, curious now. "So the transition's on schedule?" "Perfectly," Hayes replied. "Blair's already being received as a future. Fresh energy, clean optics." "Clean optics. And Simone?" the consultant asked. "Any risk there?" Hayes exhaled, indulgent. "Minimal. She'll take a generous settlement and disappear quietly. Probably back to consulting or academia or whatever small life she had before me." Small. The word echoed louder than the rest. Simone didn't move. She didn't breathe. She felt something precise and irreversible take shape in her chest. Not rage, not grief, but understanding. Clear, sharp, almost merciful in its honesty. This wasn't cruelty born of conflict. This was strategy. On the call, they moved on, laughing, congratulating Hayes on how smoothly he'd handled things. Someone praised his leadership. Someone else mentioned a donor who was very impressed with Blair's recent appearance. Then came the final blow. "The key," Hayes said, voice warm with pride, "is making sure she never realizes her value." Silence followed, not on the call, but inside Simone. It was as if every moment she'd ever minimized herself lined up in her mind, orderly and damning. Every time she'd softened her voice so he could sound decisive. Every time she'd step back so he could step forward. Every time she'd accepted being called intuitive instead of intelligent, supportive instead of strategic. Not because she lacked awareness, because she'd believed in partnership. The call ended with more laughter, more certainty. Hayes's chair scraped softly as he stood, footsteps moving toward the bedroom. Simone poured the coffee down the sink. She walked through the apartment slowly, as if gravity had changed and she was relearning how to move within it. The art, the furniture, the photographs, all of it rearranged itself in her mind, not as memories, but as evidence. By the time Hayes emerged, adjusting his cufflinks, Simone was sitting at the dining table with her laptop open. He paused when he saw her. "Morning," he said lightly. "Morning," she replied, her voice steady. He poured himself coffee, oblivious. "I'll be out most of the day. Meetings." "Of course," Simone said. He kissed her cheek, brief, absent, familiar, and walked out. The door closed. Simone waited until she heard the elevator chime before she moved. Her hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment. Not in doubt, but in recognition. This was the moment Isadora had warned her about, the one where emotion would beg her to act impulsively. She didn't. She made one call. Isadora answered on the second ring. "I heard him," Simone said. There was no need to explain. Isadora exhaled slowly on the other end. "Then you're ready." "Yes," Simone replied. "I'm done protecting a story that was written to erase me." A pause, then softly, "Good." Simone ended the call and closed her laptop. She stood in the center of the apartment, the house of beautiful lies, and felt something unexpected settle over her. Relief. Because heartbreak still leaves room for hope. This left only truth. And truth, once heard, changes everything. Simone did not leave the apartment in a blaze of drama. She left like a woman going to work. There was a particular calm that came after the call, the kind that settles when illusion finally dies. She showered, dressed in clean lines and quiet authority, and pulled her hair back the way she used to when she walked into negotiations abroad. Not the softer style Hayes liked for photos, the version that made men listen before they decided how to categorize her. She opened the notebook Isadora had given her and added a new page at the front. Counter story. Not revenge, not response. Counter story. Because Hayes had built his power the way many men did, not by being the smartest in the room, but by controlling what the room believed. If Simone wanted her life back, she couldn't merely correct a lie. She had to replace it with something stronger, something people could not ignore. The first step was not public. It was private, surgical. She began making calls, not to mutual friends, not to Chicago's social circle that had already chosen comfort over courage, but to the people who remembered her before she became Mrs. Calloway. Her first call went overseas to Nairobi. A former colleague answered with a burst of warmth that hit Simone like sunlight. "Simone Reed? I thought you disappeared into billionaire life." Simone smiled faintly. "I didn't disappear," she said. "I just got quiet." The man laughed, then softened. "What's going on?" Simone didn't offer details. She didn't need to. She asked one question, carefully phrased. If someone wanted to verify where the strategy for the East Africa Corridor Partnership came from, she said, who would they call? A pause. Then, you, or me, or Dr. Alima's team. Everyone knows you built that framework. Simone wrote the names down. Next was London. A professor she hadn't spoken to in years remembered her immediately, remembered her thesis, remembered her debates in seminar rooms where she refused to accept easy answers. When Simone asked about contacts in European development finance, the professor didn't hesitate. "You still have more credibility than half the men holding the microphones," he said. "Tell me what you need." Then Sao Paulo, then Washington, then a small foundation in Atlanta she'd advised early in her career, before Hayes, before the penthouse, before her name became a polished accessory. Each call returned the same thing, the truth, intact. Simone had expected erosion, damage, the slow poison Hayes had been dripping into rooms she could no longer enter. But outside Chicago, her reputation hadn't been rewritten because Hayes's influence had limits. And that realization was both devastating and liberating. She'd spent years believing her power was tied to his platform. It wasn't. His platform had been built on hers. By the third day, Simone's notebook was full. Names with arrows, organizations with histories, donors with memories, journalists who had once trusted her instincts, people who didn't worship Hayes because they had never needed him. She began requesting meetings, not in her voice as a wife, but in her voice as a strategist. The difference was immediate. A former colleague suggested a private introduction to a venture partner in New York who specialized in social impact capital. A policy director in D.C. offered to connect her with a journalist who had been itching to understand how Calloway's empire was built so quickly. Simone listened without reacting. She stored everything. Then came the hardest part, the temptation to strike first, to leak the emails, to blast the memos, to tell the world what Hayes had said about her on that call. She imagined the satisfaction of watching his polished image crack under public outrage. But Isadora's warning echoed. Men like Hayes are most dangerous when they feel cornered. So Simone didn't go for outrage. She went for inevitability. She asked herself the question Hayes had always asked before stepping into a room. What does the audience want to believe? Chicago's donors wanted stability. Institutions wanted safety. Media wanted a story that felt clean, compelling, and undeniable. No one wanted messy, he said, she said. And no one, especially in the circles Hayes operated, wanted to admit they'd been fooled. So Simone designed a counter-story that allowed them to change sides without shame. She built it on 3 pillars. Proof, not accusations, documentation. Authority, not emotion, expert validation. Opportunity, not destruction, a better investment. While Hayes was polishing his campaign rollout, Simone was gathering endorsements from people who wouldn't risk their names for gossip. She secured quiet statements from respected professionals, economists, board chairs, nonprofit directors, people who could say, plainly, "I worked with Simone. I know what she built." And then she began crafting the final piece, the one that would transform her from a wronged wife into something far more threatening. A proposition, a new venture, already moving, already real. A future that did not require Hayes' permission. Because the most viral kind of justice isn't watching a man fall. It's watching a woman rise so high that his fall becomes irrelevant. On the seventh night, Simone sat at the dining table with her notebook open and a legal pad beside it. She wrote a name at the top of the page, then underlined it twice. Reed Strategy Group. It wasn't final. It didn't need to be. What mattered was what it represented. Simone looked around the apartment one last time. The immaculate furniture, the curated art, the glass walls meant to display a life. She realized something with a clarity that felt almost gentle. Hayes could keep the penthouse. He could keep the photos. He could keep the narrative he'd built. She was building something else. And when the moment came, when the room finally looked at her instead of through her, Simone Reed would not be asking for her place back. She would be offering them a better one. The invitation arrived on thick, cream-colored paper, elegant, understated, unmistakably expensive. Hayes Calloway held it between his fingers with satisfaction, the corners of his mouth lifting as he read it again. A private donor summit, invitation only, no press, no aides, just capital, influence, and the promise of alignment. The kind of meeting that didn't make headlines, but decided who would eventually own them. Exactly his kind of room. "They're finally ready," he said aloud, more to himself than to Blair, who stood beside him in the mirror, adjusting her earrings. "This is where it locks in." Blair smiled, practiced, and bright. "I told you they were warming up to me." Hayes glanced at her reflection. She looked flawless, young, composed, photogenic in a way donors like to imagine their futures. He nodded, indulgent. "Just stay close," he said. "Let me handle the heavy conversations." She missed the emphasis. Across the city, in a quiet conference room overlooking the river, Simone Reed folded the same invitation and slid it into her bag. Her expression didn't change. She'd known it was coming. In fact, she'd been counting on it, because rooms like this never ask questions in advance. They assumed answers would be provided by whoever stood at the center. The summit was held at a private skyscraper club, high above the city, glass walls, muted lighting, a view designed to make everyone inside feel above consequence. The elevator ride alone felt ceremonial. Hayes stepped out first, shoulders back, confidence effortless. Blair followed half a step behind, exactly where he liked her. They were greeted warmly, handshakes, familiar smiles, a few congratulatory murmurs about momentum and timing. Hayes absorbed it easily, the way he always had, mistaking anticipation for loyalty. He noticed something was off, only when he reached the main room. The seating was wrong, not chaotic, intentional. The long table wasn't arranged in the gentle hierarchy Hayes preferred, where he sat at the center and others angled toward him. Instead, people stood in small clusters, engaged, focused, around someone else. A woman in charcoal gray. Hayes slowed. Simone stood near the windows, speaking quietly with Isadora Vale, and two men Hayes recognized instantly. One a major political donor, the other a development economist whose endorsement Hayes had chased unsuccessfully for months. They were listening to her, not politely, attentively. Blair's hand tightened around Hayes' arm. "What is she doing here?" Blair whispered. Hayes didn't answer. His smile held, but something in his eyes sharpened. This wasn't anger yet, it was irritation, the kind that came from encountering an unplanned variable. Simone turned. Their eyes met across the room. For a fraction of a second, Hayes searched her face for the woman he thought he knew, the one who hesitated, who softened, who deferred. What he saw instead was unfamiliar, not cold, focused, composed in a way that didn't ask permission. She nodded to him once, polite, professional. It unsettled him more than confrontation would have. Isadora stepped forward then, her presence commanding without effort. "Gentlemen," she said smoothly, "I believe you all know Hayes Calloway. But before we begin, there's someone I want you to hear from." She gestured toward Simone. Hayes opened his mouth to speak, some instinctive move to reclaim the floor. But the moment had already shifted. Chairs were being pulled out. People were settling, not around him, but around her. Simone took her seat at the head of the table, not his side. The head. "I appreciate everyone making the time today," Simone began, her voice steady, unhurried. "Before any commitments are discussed, I felt it was important to clarify a few things about strategy, authorship, and alignment." Blair felt a ripple of unease run through her. She scanned the room for reassurance, but Hayes was silent now, his jaw tight, his confidence recalibrating too slowly. This wasn't a scandal. This wasn't an ambush. It was worse. It was a conversation they hadn't prepared for. Simone clicked a remote in her hand. A screen behind her illuminated, not with accusations, not with drama, but with clean, elegant data. Timelines, project names, market expansions Hayes had once claimed as his vision. "Many of you have invested," Simone said, "based on results you were told originated with Hayes's leadership. Today, I want to ensure you have full visibility into how those results were actually achieved." A murmur passed through the room. Hayes finally spoke. "Simone," he said lightly, attempting humor, "I think this may not be the appropriate forum." She looked at him calmly. "It's exactly the appropriate forum." The trap didn't snap shut with noise. It closed with silence. Because every person in that room realized the same thing at once. They hadn't been invited to witness a power struggle. They had been invited to witness a correction. And Hayes Calloway, who had walked in smiling, certain of the outcome, understood, far too late, that the room no longer belonged to him. Silence has a sound when power changes hands. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It arrives like a held breath, sudden and unmistakable. The moment everyone in the room realizes they are no longer watching the person they expected to lead. Simone felt it the instant she stood. The skyscraper club, suspended above the city like a private throne, had been designed to intimidate. Glass walls, dark wood, steel and height conspiring to remind everyone inside that they were small compared to the forces that ruled the world. Hayes had always loved rooms like this. They made him feel inevitable. Today, they made him irrelevant. Simone adjusted the chair slightly before sitting at the head of the table. Not dramatically, not defiantly, with the quiet assurance of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. The movement was simple, but it recalibrated the room. Bodies leaned forward. Conversations died mid-thought. Even the hum of the city outside seemed to recede. Hayes remained standing for a fraction of a second too long. Blair noticed it before anyone else. She felt it in her stomach, that sudden drop when gravity shifts and you realize you're no longer aligned with the center. Her hand slipped from Hayes's arm as he finally took a seat, his posture careful now, guarded. This was not the tableau they had rehearsed. Simone's presence was not theatrical. There was no grand gesture, no raised voice, no righteous fury. That was what made it unsettling. She didn't look like a woman interrupting a meeting. She looked like the meeting. "I won't take much of your time," Simone said, her voice calm, precise, carrying effortlessly across the table. "But before any funding decisions are finalized, there's context you deserve." Context, not accusation. She clicked the remote again. The first slide appeared. A clean timeline stretching back nearly a decade. Dates, markets, expansion phases, names of partner institutions, names several people in the room recognized immediately. Simone didn't rush. She let recognition do the work. "This," she said, gesturing lightly, "is the international growth strategy that positioned Callaway Development as a serious global player." Hayes watched, motionless, as familiar territory was mapped in unfamiliar ways. Not as triumphs, but as processes. Not as brilliance, but as labor, Simone continued. What's often presented as instinct or leadership is, in reality, the result of sustained research, long-term relationship building, and strategic negotiation. She paused, just long enough. I know, she added, because I built it. A ripple moved through the room. Not shock, but recalibration. Pens stopped. A donor's brow furrowed. Someone shifted in their chair, uncomfortable not because of conflict, but because of clarity. Blair felt heat crawl up her neck. She glanced at Hayes, waiting for him to interrupt, to reassert control, to do something. He didn't, because this was not a moment that could be managed with charm. Simone moved through the presentation methodically. She showed early drafts of strategies, her annotations still visible. Emails documenting introductions she'd made. Calendars marking meetings she'd organized, negotiated, closed. Nothing sensational, nothing personal. Just facts. The kind of facts that strip illusion without raising their voice. You were told these outcomes emerged organically, Simone said, meeting the eyes of a man who had once praised Hayes' vision publicly. They didn't. They were engineered. She shifted to the next slide. Cultural initiatives, donor programs, diversity frameworks. Several of these projects were later attributed to new leadership, she continued, her tone neutral. In reality, they were extensions of research and pilot programs I designed years earlier. Blair swallowed hard. One of the donors turned toward her, curiosity replacing approval. Ms. Sutherland, he said politely, perhaps you can elaborate on the early modeling phase Simone is referencing. Blair opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She glanced at Hayes again, but he was staring at the table now, jaw set, calculating too late. He had underestimated the moment. He had assumed Simone would either explode or disappear. He had never prepared for precision. Simone let the silence stretch. Not to humiliate, but to allow the truth to settle into its proper weight. When she spoke again, it was not to condemn, but to conclude. I'm not here to revisit the past, she said. I'm here because the future is being negotiated in this room. And I believe decisions are strongest when they're made with full information. She clicked to the final slide. A new logo appeared. Clean, confident, unmistakably independent. A new name. This, Simone said, is what I'm building now, with partners who value transparency, authorship, and results. The air in the room changed completely. Questions followed, not defensive ones, not polite ones, but serious ones. Strategic ones, the kind reserved for people whose time mattered. Simone answered them without hesitation. Hayes sat back in his chair, watching the room move away from him in real time. Blair felt herself fading at his side, no longer a symbol of renewal, but a reminder of miscalculation. Simone didn't look at either of them as the meeting continued. She didn't need to. Her entrance had already stopped the room, and once a room stops for you, it never goes back to pretending you aren't there. The men at that table were used to owning the air. They owned companies, districts, headlines. They sat on boards that decided which ideas would be celebrated and which would be buried. They were kings of a modern kind. No crowns, just influence. And influence had taught them a dangerous habit. They believed truth was negotiable if the right person spoke first. Simone didn't speak first, she spoke last. And when she did, she came with receipts. The screen behind her shifted to a single slide, simple, unadorned. 3 project titles, 3 expansion phases Hayes had built entire speeches around, 3 miracles donors loved to repeat as proof of his genius. Simone's voice remained calm as she pointed to the first. Project North Shore Corridor, she said, the cross-border infrastructure partnership that made the Midwest portfolio profitable. Hayes' throat moved as he swallowed. Blair sat very still, hands folded tightly in her lap, her posture a brittle imitation of composure. Simone clicked again. A scanned memo appeared, dated 8 years earlier. Simone's name in the header, a strategy outline in her handwriting, then an email chain. introductions to regulatory advisors and municipal partners, a meeting schedule, a list of risks and mitigation steps. This partnership didn't happen because Hayes believed, Simone said, her tone almost conversational. It happened because it was engineered, with risk modeling, stakeholder mapping, and relationship building that began long before it became a talking point. A donor leaned forward, squinting at the screen. He recognized the names, the meetings, the timeline. He'd been there. He just hadn't known who built the scaffolding beneath the moment. Simone moved to the second project, Lakefront Renewal Initiative, she continued. The redevelopment plan that shifted public opinion in Hayes' favor. This one, she knew, would land hard. It had been the project that made Hayes look like a visionary rather than just another developer. Community investment, green space, the language of progress. Simone clicked. A grant proposal appeared. Not a copy. The original draft, track changes visible, comments in the margins. Simone's notes about coalition building, conflict resolution, the exact phrasing that would appeal to neighborhood leaders and appease skeptical donors. Then a calendar entry surfaced, Simone's schedule for a week of meetings with community organizers. Names in the notes, numbers, locations. This was not branding, Simone said, eyes moving slowly across the room. This was trust, and trust is earned face-to-face in rooms where cameras aren't invited. The table had gone quiet. Not shocked, worse, they were recalculating. Because the receipts didn't simply accuse Hayes of taking credit. They revealed how thoroughly he had been built. Simone's third project was the most damning because it was the one Blair had been paraded around for. Equity Access Framework, Simone said. The diversity initiative currently being presented as new leadership. Blair's breath caught, almost imperceptible. But Simone heard it. She felt it ripple through the silence like an animal sensing danger. Simone clicked. The screen displayed a document with a familiar structure, clean headings, measurable outcomes, phased implementation. Beneath it, another file, a research bibliography, international case studies, policy models, the kind of foundation real strategy required. And here, Simone said softly, are the notes from the lunch meeting where I presented this to the board 6 months ago. She let the date hang there. Then she clicked again. An email response from a foundation director appeared. Not the right fit for our current strategic direction. Simone didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply continued. 2 weeks later, she said, the same framework was presented again, through different channels, credited to different leadership. Blair's face flushed. The room turned toward her with a new kind of interest. Not admiration, not anger, but scrutiny. The kind that stripped glamour down to competence. A board chair cleared his throat. Ms. Sutherland, he said, polite as a knife, can you speak to the research basis behind your proposal? Specifically, the international models referenced here. Blair's lips parted. She looked at Hayes just once, searching for rescue. Hayes didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Simone now. Not with guilt, but with disbelief, as if he couldn't understand how she had gotten access to the room he'd spent years trying to control. Blair's voice came out thinner than she intended. Our team, she began. We drew from... Which team? Someone asked. Another pause. Blair swallowed. We collaborated. The silence that followed was not cruel. It was terminal. Simone clicked to the next slide before the discomfort could become theater. She refused to let this be reduced to humiliation. This was bigger than Blair's inadequacy. This was about authorship, about who created value and who simply wore it. You don't have to take my word for it, Simone said, and her tone sharpened, not with anger, but authority. Several individuals here can verify these documents. They received these emails. They attended these meetings. They spoke to me directly. She gestured toward the far end of the table. A man Simone had never needed to charm because he respected her mind, leaned forward and nodded once. Then another. Then another. And just like that, Hayes' mythology began to unravel. Not because Simone attacked it, but because the room recognized a counterfeit when the original was sitting in front of them. Simone let the final slide appear, clean, confident, unmistakably forward-looking. A new firm, a new mission, a new set of contracts already in motion. "I'm not asking you to punish anyone," Simone said, meeting their eyes one by one. "I'm asking you to invest accurately." The room shifted. Questions turned towards Simone, sharp and excited. Not about Hayes, not about the marriage, about her plan, her vision, her motnet, her network. Hayes sat frozen, watching attention drain away from him like water leaving a cracked vessel. Blair's hands trembled faintly in her lap, the mask slipping further with each unanswered question. Simone remained composed, answering with the steady clarity of someone who had been underestimated so long she'd learned to weaponize restraint. Receipts did not shout. They didn't need to. In a room full of kings, Simone Reed had brought the one thing power could not argue with: proof. Blair had always believed the fall would come with noise, raised voices, accusations, a public spectacle she could spin, soften, survive. She had prepared herself for outrage, for a jealous wife, for tears, for scenes that could be dismissed as emotional excess. What she had not prepared for was this: being ignored. The shift happened quietly, almost politely. It began when a donor who had been nodding along to her earlier commentary leaned past her to ask Simone a question, one that assumed competence, depth, authority. "And how would you scale that partnership across regions with conflicting regulatory priorities?" he asked. Simone answered without hesitation, referencing examples from East Africa and Eastern Europe, drawing lines between policy, culture, and capital with an ease that felt practiced, because it was. Blair sat beside Hayes, her spine straight, her smile intact, but the air around her had thinned. No one looked to her now. No one checked her reactions. The center of gravity had moved, and she had been left orbiting a star that was no longer luminous. She tried to reinsert herself. "I'd just add," Blair said lightly, "that adaptability is key. Being open to change." A man across the table raised a hand, not rudely, just decisively. "Thank you," he said, already turning back to Simone. "Please continue. Please continue." The dismissal was surgical. Blair felt heat crawl up her neck, then settle uncomfortably behind her eyes. She reached for her water glass, but her hand trembled slightly. She wrapped both hands around it, willing herself to steady. Hayes leaned toward her, his voice low. "Let it go," he murmured. "Let it go." The phrase landed like an indictment. She looked at him then, really looked, at the way he avoided her gaze, at how his attention flicked between Simone and the investors, calculating, adapting. The realization came uninvited and unwelcome. He wasn't defending her. He was distancing himself. The meeting pressed on. More questions, more interest. All of it directed away from Blair, away from Hayes, towards Simone and the future she was outlining with such unnerving clarity. When a board member finally addressed Blair directly again, it was not with praise. "Ms. Sutherland," he said, voice courteous but cool, "could you clarify your specific qualifications in this space? Your background, perhaps?" The question hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. Blair opened her mouth. She closed it. She could list titles, roles she'd been given, positions she'd stepped into quickly, confidently. But qualifications, earned ones, documented ones, slipped through her fingers. "I've worked closely with Hayes on communications strategy," she said finally, "and I've been deeply involved in shaping messaging," the man finished for her, not unkindly. "I see." The words were devastating in their precision. Messaging, not strategy, not architecture, not authorship. Just messaging. Blair's face burned. She glanced at Hayes again, expecting him to step in, to reframe, to rescue her the way he always had. He didn't. Instead, he shifted in his seat and cleared his throat. "Blair's been a tremendous support," he said vaguely, "but Simone has always had a deeper involvement in these initiatives. Always, the words struck Blair like a physical blow. Support. She felt something inside her finally crack. Not publicly, not yet, but enough to send fractures racing through the carefully constructed image she'd been wearing like armor. This wasn't partnership. This was succession without security. She had believed proximity to power meant protection, that being chosen meant being safe, that replacing someone meant inheriting their place. But she was learning the truth too late. You don't inherit power by standing next to it. You inherit risk. As the meeting drew to a close, investors rose from their seats, not toward Hayes, not toward Blair, but toward Simone. Business cards exchanged hands. Meetings were suggested. Futures were discussed in low, energized tones. Blair stood as well, but no one met her eyes. She felt invisible. And invisibility, she now understood, was not neutral. It was a verdict. As people filed out, Hayes finally turned to her. His voice was careful, controlled. "We'll talk later," he said. Later. The words sounded different now. Not a promise, a postponement. Blair watched Simone gather her materials, calm and unhurried, as Isadora leaned in to say something that made her smile. It was not a triumphant smile. It was steadier than that. The smile of someone who had stopped asking for permission. In that moment, Blair understood with painful clarity. She had not been elevated. She had been used. And now that the room no longer needed her as a symbol, she was expendable. The mistress always falls first, not because she is the most guilty, but because she is the easiest to let go. The city looks different when it finally belongs to you. Simone Reed stood on the terrace of her corner office, 40 floors above the Chicago River, watching the late afternoon sun turn glass and steel into fire. The wind lifted her hair gently, no longer something she bothered to control. Below her, the city moved with its familiar urgency, but for the first time, she wasn't reacting to it, she was shaping it. Reed's strategy group no longer needed introductions. 18 months earlier, it had been an idea written in a notebook. Now it was a firm with offices on 3 continents, advising governments, cultural institutions, and global investors on development strategies that actually worked, because they were built on truth, not optics. Simone's name appeared in policy briefings, keynote programs, and board invitations not as an accessory, not as a footnote, but as authority. Hayes Calloway's name surfaced far less often. His campaign never recovered from that meeting. Donors didn't denounce him publicly. They simply redirected their money. His company survived, but in a diminished form, stripped of the credibility that had once made it impressive. People had learned an uncomfortable lesson. Borrowed brilliance always expires. Simone didn't follow his decline closely. She didn't need to. What mattered more were the emails. They arrived quietly at first. One from a woman she recognized as the wife of a former board member. "I watched what you did," the message read. "It made me realize how small I've been taught to stay. I've started documenting everything." Then another and another. Women from those same rooms, galas, fundraisers, committees. Women who had learned to smile through erasure, who had been called supportive when they were strategic, intuitive when they were intelligent. They weren't asking Simone to fight their battles. They were asking how to prepare. Simone answered every one. Not with rage, with method. Document, protect your work. Build something that exists without permission. On a Friday evening, as the city lights flickered on one by one, Simone glanced at her calendar. A mentoring session tomorrow. A policy call with Nairobi next week. A keynote in London after that. Her life was full, not of noise, but of alignment. She thought back to the woman who had stood at the museum gala, humiliated and silent, wondering how everything had been taken from her so quickly. That woman hadn't disappeared. She had been gathering herself. Simone smiled, not sharply, not bitterly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had stopped waiting to be chosen. Some women are erased because they allow the story to be written without them. Others refuse. And when they do, they don't just reclaim their own lives. They leave doors open behind them. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever felt minimized, replaced, or quietly pushed out of your own narrative, stay here. Like this story, share your thoughts, follow along. Because the women who refuse to disappear, they're just getting started.